At the heart of your budget is the return to surplus in 3 years. So much for the wrecking ball, I guess.
Fran, can I just make a point about that? Because a wrecking ball did go through our revenues last year to the tune of $210 billion, and there's still a wrecking ball in our revenues to the tune of $110 billion, which is what makes this budget outcome all the more remarkable.
Okay, the budget will be repaired by a tax windfall that comes into play, not this year, as you say, but it's gearing up. All compliments to China, really, and its demand for our resources,
isn't it? It's not just a tax windfall. It's the spending discipline that we are showing in this budget. It's not all down to a tax windfall. It's the spending discipline as well. That is a very significant contribution to this surplus and to halving net debt.
The point is we wouldn't be in surplus in 3 years if there wasn't a dramatic recovery of receipts, tax receipts from companies and individuals. Isn't that true?
Fran, we wouldn't be in surplus if it wasn't for the very strict application of our 2% rule, which has been very hard. It has produced some difficult outcomes in this budget. What we have shown is the discipline that we said we would show last year when we responsibly stimulated the economy to support employment. Now that growth is returning, we have applied a 2% cap on all of our spending, and that is a very significant discipline, and that's what you see in the budget bottom line. Yes, there's the return of revenues, but as I said to you before, revenues are still down by $110 billion on what they were prior to the global financial crisis.
That's this year, but what about 2 years out? Revenues are up dramatically, aren't they?
That's out to 12-13, the $110 billion figure. Revenues are coming back. That is true. You don't see them in the current year. You see them coming back in 10-11, and you do see them coming back. But they are not coming back to the extent that they were there prior to the global financial crisis, which is what has made this budget even more difficult and made the 2% rule even more important.
Isn't it true, though, and this is what the opposition is pointing out, that this is you return to surplus in 3 years, which is a remarkable feat if it occurs, is predicated on the best terms of trade for 60 years. Why isn't that a risky assumption?
It's not just the best terms of trade. Yes, our nominal income is going to be up. The terms of trade are at 60-year highs, but in terms of the consolidation that we're putting into this budget, this is the biggest consolidation in many years since the 1960s. So the budget is consolidating to the tune of something like 4.5% over 3 years, reducing its impact on our economy over 3 years. That is what is so important in coming back to surplus.
Okay.
Yes, we've got revenue upgrades. Yes, the terms of trade are good. And yes, for the future, that is going to be very important for Australia. But what is more important for Australia right now is the fiscal discipline that we have put in place so we can meet those fiscal rules that we outlined last year.
I accept you want to make your credentials in terms of good conservative fiscal managers, and that's what this consolidation is all about. But there's two parts to the return to surplus, and part of that is an increased terms of trade. The best terms of trade for 60 years. The opposition says that's risky to bank on that.
Well, we're not banking exclusively on the best
Not exclusively,
terms of trade.
but that is a contributor. You have to.
Of course it's a contributor. It's a contributor at any stage in the budget, like everything else is a contributor to the budget outcome. But we have been very conservative in our terms of trade assumption. Very conservative. Yes, we are at a 60-year high. That's undeniable. I'm sure the opposition can't deny that. But as we go forward, we don't assume that they remain forever at 60-year highs. But there is a very bright commodity outlook for this country. We know that. That's one of the reasons why we moved over a week ago in our response to the report of the Independent Tax Inquiry, recognising what comes with a high terms of trade and strong demand for our commodities, brings a two-speed economy. How are we going to respond to that? How are we going to deal with the inflationary pressures that flow from that? That's what the package a week and a half ago was all about, and it is of course incorporated in this budget. But let me make this one point, that the money from the resource super profits tax is not responsible for the budget coming back to surplus. Every dollar of that is dedicated to economic reform. If that doesn't pass, those economic reforms don't go forward. But the budget is still in surplus.
Okay, so even though the first year of surplus, according to the budget papers, is also the first year you collect the mining tax, $3 billion worth, for a $1 billion surplus,
it's not responsible for the surplus in that year because the monies are being spent on those purposes that we outlined a week and a half ago, putting money into the superannuation accounts of low-income workers, putting a tax cut in there for small business. Those are the purposes to which those monies are dedicated. And if we don't get $1 of that revenue, those don't go ahead.
Okay, so let's be clear on that. If the mining profits tax doesn't go ahead, there's none of those super improvements, there's no cut to company taxes, and also there's not two of the announcements you announced last night. Is that right? The refund on the interest in your savings deposits?
Because we are absolutely determined to meet our fiscal goals, to have that tight discipline for all the reasons that I explained last night.
The mining industry, the opposition, and I'm pretty sure I heard the Chamber of Commerce and Industry talking about this too, though, are concerned that if you slow the resources boom with the mining profits tax, with the great big new resource profits tax, that you could slow the resources boom and that could then slow the growth forecast. Does that concern you?
Well, we believe that the tax regime we have outlined is good for investment. It is good for investment. Now, there's going to be a lot of argy-bargy about this tax. I don't expect some of the very big companies that will pay a bit more to be happy, to be on the sidelines clapping about it. But I can tell you this, the biggest project in this country's history, the Gorgon project, a $50 billion project, was approved last year, and it operates under a resource rent tax of 40%.
Talking of the big miners, are they coming to the negotiating table yet on this tax?
Well, there's certainly over 80 companies that are talking to the Treasury.
What about the big ones? What about Rio? What about BHP Billiton?
They're all talking to the Treasury, as we said they would, and as we must. That consultation process that was outlined over a week and a half ago is in full swing right now.
How much room is there to move on the point where the profit tax cuts in? Could it be higher than the 6%?
Well, I've made the point. We've set out our design of the tax in the package over a week ago. We said we'd talk about generous transition arrangements for existing projects. We're talking to the companies at the moment, and that's where it should be. The
Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, Rick Battolino, was quoted this week saying he said the best thing that could happen is for one of the big projects, mining projects, to fall over. Do we need to slow down the mining boom?
We don't intend to slow down the mining boom. What we intend to do is to invest in capacity to make sure we get the investment environment right, to get rid of a royalty regime which punishes many projects and doesn't encourage their development or their growth, to put a fair system of taxation in so the industry can grow sustainably. It's a very, very important part of our economy, but it hasn't been paying its fair share. The royalty regime has not been collecting the fair share of the mineral resources of the Australian people. That has to be updated, and that's why we want to devote every cent that we get from that to expanding the productive capacity of this economy, to encouraging investment more broadly, particularly when it comes to small business and company taxation.
It's 17 to 8 on RM Breakfast. Our guest this morning is the Treasurer, Wayne Swan. Treasurer, the government has been accused of over-promising and under-delivering in the past. Is there danger of that here in this budget? If you look at some of your health measures, an extra 23 super GP clinics. The point's been made, you promised 36 at the last election. There's only 14 underway, a long way off delivering them, and now you expect voters to believe you're going to build another 23.
Well, that sort of cynicism I just reject.
Why is it cynical? I mean,
it is cynical, and let me explain why. I mean, if you're going to reform the health system, it doesn't happen in 1 year, it doesn't happen in 2 years, and it doesn't happen in 3 years. Reform has been desperately required in the health system of this country when it comes to our hospital system on the one hand and our primary care system on the other.
But why does it take 3 years to build a super clinic?
Well, because you have to get it planned properly, and they are underway. You've correctly said there are 14 that are well advanced. There are more we are going to do. Last night we outlined plans to renovate hundreds of additional GP clinics and so on. These things all take time. We have spent 3 years working on a comprehensive health plan for the nation, a renovation of its funding, because it's very important in terms of the intergenerational report and what ageing will do to health costs. That's been a very important part of it. Service delivery has been another important part of it. Value for money has been another very important part of it. All of this is really complex long-term policy, and it takes a while to get going. I'm constantly surprised when people demand long-term reforms and say, why aren't the results here today?
Treasurer, there's plenty more we should be talking through and perhaps talking about, and perhaps over the coming weeks we can flesh out a bit more about some of your other policies. There's a lot there in health, but just the politics. You said last night this is not a pre-election budget, but it is a budget designed to remind voters that Australia skirted the recession, emerged stronger than the rest of the world from the global financial crisis.
We're proud of what the Australian people achieved during the global recession. Working with stimulus, we produced an outcome, the envy of the world. And of course that stimulus was opposed by our political opponents, and if they'd had their way, Australia would have been in recession in calendar year 2009. Unemployment would have been far higher, the deficit would have been far higher, and the debt would have been far higher.
And you feel like you haven't had credit for that?
Well, What we have to do is the job the Australian people elect us to do. They elect us to protect our economy, to grow it, to make it strong, to have prosperity, to spread opportunity. That's what we do.